Welcome to Orbit into Sleep. I am so glad you are here, and I mean that. Whether you have just climbed into bed, pulled the covers up to your chin, or you are already halfway to somewhere dreamy, this is your space now. Tonight, we are going to drift together through the fascinating story of the Space Shuttle, one of the most extraordinary machines ever built by human hands. And we are going to take our time with it, nice and slowly, letting each idea settle gently into your mind like stars appearing one by one in a darkening sky. Before we begin, if you enjoy this kind of content, please do consider giving us a like and subscribing to Orbit into Sleep. It truly helps other restless minds find their way here. People just like you, searching for something calm and interesting to carry them off to sleep. It means more than you know. And while you are thinking about it, we would love to know in the comments, roughly how many hours of sleep do you normally get each night? No judgment at all. Some of us are 8-hour dreamers. Some of us are lucky to snatch 5. Whatever your number, you are very welcome here. Now, I want you to do something for me. If you have not already, I would like you to get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop. Unclench your jaw. Feel the weight of your body resting into your mattress or your pillow or your sofa, wherever you have chosen to nest tonight. There is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do. Your only job right now is to breathe and maybe listen. Tonight's video is called Relaxing Space Shuttle Facts to Fall Asleep To, and that is exactly what it is. No loud moments, no sudden music, no mid-roll ads to jolt you out of your rest. Just a gentle journey through one of humanity's greatest adventures. The Space Shuttle flew for 30 years. 30 years of launches, of discoveries, of people looking up at the sky and feeling that particular kind of wonder that only space can bring. And we have all the time in the world to explore it together. So, take one slow breath in and let it go. And when you are ready, let's drift up into orbit. The dream before the shuttle. Let's begin right at the very beginning, not with a launch or a countdown or a roar of engines, but with an idea. Because before the space shuttle ever existed, before a single bolt was turned or a single tile was fitted, there was a dream. And like all the best dreams, it was beautifully, almost impossibly ambitious. It was the late 1960s, and America had just done something that most of the world had considered pure fantasy. It had sent human beings to the moon. The Apollo program had captured the imagination of an entire planet, and NASA, flushed with that extraordinary success, began to think about what might come next. Not just another moonshot, but something more permanent, something that would change the relationship between humanity and space forever. The vision, put forward in 1969 by a group called the Space Task Group, was breathtaking in its scope. They imagined an entire ecosystem in space. There would be a large, permanent space station orbiting the Earth. There would be a reusable spacecraft, a kind of cosmic bus, flying back and forth between Earth and that station on a regular basis, almost like an airline route. There would be a space tug, a small vehicle for moving satellites from one orbit to another. And beyond all of that, there were even plans for a reusable nuclear-powered upper stage, a vehicle that could carry crews not just to orbit but onward, deeper into the solar system. Sit with that for a moment. In 1969, with human beings having only just reached the moon for the very first time, NASA was already sketching out what looked remarkably like the opening chapters of a science fiction novel. It was a grand, sweeping, almost poetic plan for our future among the stars. Of course, as so often happens with the grandest of dreams, reality had other ideas. The early 1970s brought with them a very different mood. The space race with the Soviet Union was cooling. The public's attention was beginning to drift toward other concerns: Vietnam, economic pressures, a general sense that perhaps it was time to look closer to home for a while. And President Nixon's administration was making deep cuts across government spending. NASA's enormous budget from the Apollo years began to shrink, and with it, the grand vision began to shrink too. Upper stage, gone. What remained was just upper stage, gone. What remained was just one piece of the puzzle, the reusable shuttle itself, stripped back and made to work within a budget that was a fraction of what had first been imagined. And here is something rather lovely to hold on to as you settle into your pillow. Even in that reduced form, even as a compromise, even as a vehicle born from budget arguments and political negotiation, rather than pure engineering idealism, what they built was still astonishing. The shape of a dream, even a trimmed down dream, can still take your breath away. On the 5th of January, 1972, President Richard Nixon stood before the cameras and officially announced the Space Shuttle program to the world. He framed it in optimistic, practical language, describing it as a vehicle that would make space travel routine. That word, routine, is quite something, isn't it? Imagine a world where slipping into orbit feels as ordinary as boarding a train. That was the promise: space travel, not as a daring expedition for a handful of heroes, but as a regular, almost everyday activity. It is rather a beautiful thought to carry with you as you breathe slowly and let your eyes grow heavy. A world where going to space is simply something that people do. Now, before Nixon's announcement and before the first drawing boards were filled with plans, there were years and years of quieter, less celebrated work that made the whole thing possible. The shuttle did not appear from nowhere. It had ancestors, early ideas, and experimental aircraft that slowly, carefully proved that this strange dream could work. One of the earliest threads in the shuttle's story stretches all the way back to the 1930s, to an engineer named Eugen Sanger and his colleague Irene Brett. Together, they imagined something they called the Silbervogel, which is German for silver bird. It was a concept for a rocket-powered aircraft that would launch, climb to the very edge of space, and then skip along the top of the atmosphere, bouncing across it like a stone skipping across the surface of a very still lake, before gliding down to land on the other side of the world. They never built it. The technology did not exist, and the circumstances of the time were not ones that led to peaceful scientific progress. But the idea, the beautiful, almost dreamlike idea of a winged vehicle that could dance between space and sky, that seed was planted, and it would grow slowly over the decades that followed. After the Second World War, American engineers began picking up those threads and weaving them into real aircraft. In the 1950s and 60s, a remarkable research plane called the X-15 began making flights that would once have seemed impossible. The X-15 was a sleek, needle-nosed rocket plane, and it flew at the very edge of the atmosphere, reaching speeds of more than 4,000 miles per hour. Some of its flights climbed so high that the pilots qualified as astronauts under United States Air Force rules. It was touching the boundary between air and space and returning home safely, and the data it gathered was invaluable. Around the same time, engineers were also experimenting with what they called lifting bodies. Now, a lifting body sounds rather technical, but the idea behind it is wonderfully simple. Normally, an aircraft gets its lift from its wings. A lifting body gets its lift from the shape of its fuselage, the main body of the craft, rather than from separate wings. Vehicles with names like the M2F2 and the HL10 and the X-24 were flown to prove that a stubby, wingless shape could glide down from altitude and land safely on a runway without any engine power at all. Unpowered, just gliding home on nothing but the shape of the machine and the skill of the pilot. Imagine that, hurtling back from the edge of space, no engines, no second chances, just trust in the mathematics of aerodynamics and the steadiness of human hands on the controls. These experiments provided something essential. They proved that a spacecraft could be designed to fly like an aircraft at the end of its mission, touching down on a runway rather than splashing into the ocean. And that was the founding promise of the shuttle. Not a capsule retrieved by ships from the sea, but a winged vehicle gliding gracefully back to a landing strip, ready to fly again. There was one more piece in this ancestry, a program called the X-20 Dinosaur. Dinosaur was an attempt in the early 1960s to build a proper piloted winged spacecraft, something that would be launched on a rocket, orbit the Earth, and then glide home. It was canceled in 1963 before it ever flew, a victim of shifting priorities and budget pressures. But the engineering work that went into it contributed enormously to what came later. So when you think about the space shuttle, I hope you will think of it not just as a machine, but as the destination of a very long journey. Decades of dreaming, sketching, testing, failing, learning, and trying again. The silver Vogel that never flew, the X-15 dancing at the edge of the sky, the stubby little lifting bodies gliding silently down to the desert floor, all of them pointing, step by step, toward that extraordinary winged shape on the launch pad at Kennedy Space Center. The shuttle carried all of those stories within it. Every rivet and every tile held a little piece of all that came before. And now, as you lie there in the quiet dark, perhaps feeling that comfortable heaviness beginning to settle through your arms and your legs. Let yourself imagine for just a moment the engineers and pilots and dreamers who spent their lives working towards something they believed in, working toward a vehicle that would one day carry human beings to orbit and bring them safely home. Not once, not twice, but over and over and over again. That is where our story begins. In dreams and in the long, patient work of turning dreams into something real. Rest easy. There is plenty more to discover and all the time in the world to find it. How do you build a spaceship? So, we have drifted through the dreams and the early experiments, the silver birds and the skipping stones of the upper atmosphere. Now, very gently, let us begin to think about how you actually take all of that dreaming and turn it into something you can bolt together in a factory. Because here is the thing about the space shuttle that I find endlessly fascinating. It was not simply invented by one brilliant person sitting at a desk with a pencil. It was argued over. It was compromised. It was pulled in different directions by different people with different needs and different budgets. And the shape that emerged from all of that pushing and pulling is one of the most recognizable silhouettes in human history. Let's begin with the question of what the shuttle was actually supposed to look like, because it went through some remarkable changes before it became the vehicle we know. In the very early stages of the design process, NASA's engineers had a clear preference. They wanted a two-stage, fully reusable system. Picture this: a very large piloted aircraft, the booster, sitting underneath a smaller piloted spacecraft, the orbiter. At launch, both would rise together. Then, at high altitude, they would separate. The booster would fly itself back to the launch site, landing like an aircraft, ready to be used again. Meanwhile, the orbiter would continue upward into space, complete its mission, and then glide home on its own. Both vehicles completely reusable, nothing thrown away, nothing lost to the ocean. It was an elegant concept, clean and symmetrical, and, in theory, efficient. The kind of design that feels deeply satisfying when you sketch it out on paper. But then came the numbers. The estimated development cost for that fully reusable two-stage system was somewhere around $10 billion. And the Office of Management and Budget, the people responsible for making sure the government did not spend money it did not have, looked at that figure and very firmly said no. The budget available was closer to $5 billion. Something had to give. What followed was a series of difficult conversations and design revisions that gradually pushed the shuttle away from that clean ideal and towards something more pragmatic. The large piloted booster was the first casualty. It was replaced by something simpler and cheaper: two uncrewed solid rocket boosters, tall cylindrical tubes packed with solid propellant, which would provide the raw power needed to get the stack off the ground and then be jettisoned and recovered from the ocean for reuse. Then there was the question of fuel storage. In the original design, both the booster and the orbiter would carry their propellant internally, tucked inside their own structures. But to reduce the size and complexity of the orbiter, engineers proposed moving the main fuel supply outside the vehicle entirely into a large external tank that would be carried alongside the orbiter during launch and then discarded once the fuel was spent. That external tank would be the only part of the entire system that was not reused. Every flight, a brand new external tank would be built, filled, and then allowed to break apart and burn up in the atmosphere over the Indian Ocean once its job was done. It was a compromise, but a workable one, so the final configuration took shape. A winged orbiter at the center of everything, the crew compartment and the payload bay, and the main engines all in one vehicle. Attached to its belly, that large orange external tank brimming with liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, and strapped to either side of the external tank, two tall white solid rocket boosters standing 149 feet high each, ready to provide that initial enormous push off the launch pad. When you stood at the base of the assembled shuttle stack and looked up, it rose 56 meters into the air. That is about the height of a 15-story building, and it weighed, at the moment of launch, approximately 2 million kilograms. 2 million kilograms. I find that number quite wonderful to sit with in the quiet of an evening. The sheer, almost incomprehensible weight of the thing. And yet it flew. Now, there is another influence on the shuttle's design that is less romantic than engineering idealism, but just as important, and that is the United States Air Force. NASA needed customers. To justify the enormous cost of developing the shuttle, they needed organizations that would actually use it and use it regularly. The Air Force was the obvious candidate. They had satellites to launch, and they were interested in having a vehicle that could carry large classified payloads into orbit. So NASA went to the Air Force, and the Air Force said, "Yes, we will use your shuttle, but we have some requirements." The first requirement was size. The Air Force needed a payload bay large enough to carry their reconnaissance satellites. The dimensions they asked for were 15 feet wide and 60 feet long. That is a substantial room. To put it another way, you could lay a double-decker bus on its side inside the shuttle's payload bay and still have room to spare. But the second requirement was the one that really shaped the shuttle's physical form, and it is the one I find most quietly fascinating. The Air Force needed what they called cross-range capability. Because of the way the Earth rotates beneath an orbiting spacecraft, a shuttle returning from certain missions might find itself descending toward a landing site that was far to one side of its flight path. The Air Force calculated that the shuttle needed to be able to glide sideways, if you will, up to 1,100 nautical miles away from its initial reentry trajectory. That is a very long way. That is roughly the distance from London to somewhere well into the Sahara Desert. To achieve that kind of sideways maneuvering during re-entry, the shuttle needed large, sweeping wings. Not the small, straight wings that some NASA engineers originally preferred, but a bold double delta wing shape. The wide triangular wings we all recognize from photographs. Those wings gave the shuttle its graceful, almost bird-like silhouette, but they also added weight. They added complexity. They required a more sophisticated heat shield because they created more surface area that needed protecting during reentry. In a very real sense, the shuttle's most iconic visual feature, those great sweeping wings, existed not because of any romantic dream of flight, but because the Air Force needed it to land far from where it expected to be. I think there is something rather poetic in that. The most beautiful part of the design, born from the most practical of demands. Let me tell you a little about who actually built all of this, because the shuttle was not the product of one company or one team. It was a vast collaboration spread across the United States. The orbiter, the main spacecraft, was built by North American Rockwell, a company based in California. The Space Shuttle main engines, the 3 powerful liquid-fueled engines at the back of the orbiter, were also produced by Rockwell. The solid rocket boosters were manufactured by a company called Morton Thiokol in segments, far away in Utah. Those segments were then loaded onto railway cars and shipped across the country to Florida, where they were carefully stacked and assembled at Kennedy Space Center. The external tank was built by Martin Marietta in Louisiana and transported by barge along the Gulf Coast to Florida. Think about that supply chain for a moment. Rocket motors traveling by rail across the American Southwest, a fuel tank the size of a small apartment building gliding slowly along the waterways of the South. Thousands of people in dozens of states, all working toward the same extraordinary goal. The orbiter itself was constructed primarily of aluminum alloy, the same material used in commercial aircraft, though titanium was used in the areas around the engines where stresses were highest. In terms of size, the orbiter was roughly comparable to a medium-sized commercial airliner, something like a DC-9 or an Airbus A320. When you saw it parked on the runway at the end of a mission, it looked almost familiar, almost ordinary, until you noticed the black tiles on its belly and the OMS pods on its tail and the Canadarm folded inside its payload bay, and then the extraordinary nature of the thing came rushing back. Inside the orbiter, the crew lived and worked in a pressurized compartment arranged across 3 levels. At the top was the flight deck, where the commander and pilot sat at their controls, surrounded by hundreds of switches and displays, with windows looking forward and upward into space. Below that was the middeck, where the rest of the crew ate and slept and exercised, a compact but functional living space. And below that again was a lower equipment bay full of the systems needed to keep the crew alive and the mission running. It was, in its own strange way, a home. A temporary, incredibly high-speed, 250-mile-high home, but a home nonetheless. And all of this, the wings shaped by Air Force requirements, the orange tank born of budget constraints, the segmented boosters made in Utah and shipped by rail, the aluminum airframe modeled on an airliner, all of it came together on that launch pad in Florida into something that looked like nothing else on Earth. Because nothing else on Earth was quite like it. As you breathe slowly and feel the weight of the night settling around you, perhaps let your mind rest on that image for a moment. The assembled stack on the pad in the Florida dawn, steam rising gently from the cold liquid oxygen venting through the external tank, floodlights casting long, soft shadows across the white and orange structure, the whole improbable, magnificent thing pointing upward into the dark sky. Waiting. Sleep well. There is still so much of this story to explore, and it will be here for you whenever you are ready. Riding the fire. Now that we know how the shuttle was designed and built, let us do something rather wonderful together. Let us go on a launch. Not a rushed, dramatic, hold your breath kind of launch. A slow, gentle one, where we notice every detail, every moment, every small miracle tucked inside the larger miracle. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. Let your breathing slow just a little more. And let's go to Florida. It is early morning at Kennedy Space Center. The kind of Florida morning where the air is already warm and heavy with humidity, and the sky is shifting from deep blue-black to something softer and lighter on the horizon. The shuttle stands on Launch Complex 39, floodlit in the pre-dawn darkness, surrounded by the launch structure. Steam drifting in soft white plumes from the vents on the external tank, where the super cold liquid oxygen is constantly boiling off a little into the warm air. The crew are already strapped in. They have been through years of training for this morning. They have run the simulation hundreds of times, and still, nothing quite prepares you for the reality of lying on your back, tilted toward the sky, in a vehicle containing more explosive energy than most people can meaningfully imagine. Let us talk about that energy for a moment, because I think it helps you understand just how extraordinary the launch sequence really was. At the moment the countdown reached 0, the 3 Space Shuttle main engines ignited first. These were the large engines at the very back of the orbiter, and they burned liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen drawn from the enormous external tank. Liquid hydrogen is the second coldest liquid that exists, sitting at around minus 253 degrees Celsius, just a whisper above absolute zero, the theoretical point at which all molecular motion stops entirely. And liquid oxygen is not much warmer. Together they produced a flame of almost colorless intensity, a combustion so efficient that the exhaust was largely steam, not the dark, smoky plume you might imagine, but something almost invisible, a shimmering distortion in the air. The main engines ignited and built up to full thrust over about 6 seconds. During those 6 seconds, the entire shuttle stack was actually pushed slightly forward and then swung back, what engineers called the twang. A gentle flex of the structure as all that thrust built up asymmetrically. The crew felt it, a slow, swaying lurch, and then the structure settling back upright. And then, at precisely the moment the stack returned to vertical, the solid rocket boosters ignited. Here is something important about solid rocket boosters. Something that perhaps makes them the most dramatic component of the entire system. Once you light a solid rocket booster, you cannot turn it off. Unlike the liquid-fueled main engines, which could be throttled and even shut down if something went wrong during those first 6 seconds, a solid rocket booster simply burns. It burns with absolute commitment until every last gram of propellant is consumed. There is no pause button, no throttle, no emergency stop. So the moment those boosters ignited, the shuttle was going. It was committed. 8 explosive bolts holding the whole stack to the launch pad fired simultaneously, and 2 million kilograms of spacecraft, fuel, and human ambition began to rise. The sound reached the viewing stands a few seconds later, and by all accounts, it was not merely loud, it was physical. A deep, crackling, almost organic roar that you felt in your chest and your rib cage and your teeth. People who witnessed shuttle launches often describe the sound as the thing they remembered most. Not the sight of it, though that was extraordinary, but the sound, the way it moved through you. Now, the shuttle did not simply go straight up. Almost immediately after clearing the launch tower, the vehicle performed what was called a roll program. It rolled and pitched so that the orbiter ended up underneath the external tank rather than on top of it, and the nose angled slightly downhill, pointing not straight up at the sky, but out over the Atlantic Ocean. This was deliberate. Flying in this heads-down, wings-rolled attitude reduced the aerodynamic stress on the wings during the densest part of the atmosphere, the region where the air was thick enough to push back hard against the accelerating vehicle. For about the first minute of flight, the shuttle actually throttled its main engines back deliberately, reducing their thrust to around 65% of maximum. This was to limit the aerodynamic forces on the structure as it passed through the region engineers called max Q, the moment of maximum dynamic pressure, where the combination of the vehicle's speed and the density of the surrounding air created the greatest mechanical stress on the airframe. After passing through max Q, the engines throttled back up and the full power of the ascent resumed. At approximately 124 seconds after liftoff, 2 minutes into the flight, something important happened. The solid rocket boosters ran out of propellant. They had done their job, providing the majority of the thrust needed to get the massive stack moving and climbing through the lower atmosphere. Now they were empty, and empty solid rocket boosters are just dead weight. Small explosive charges fired, and the boosters separated from the external tank, tumbling slowly away from the ascending orbiter. Small separation rockets on the booster casings pushed them clear of the vehicle, and then the boosters continued upward on their own momentum for a few more seconds before beginning to arc back down toward the ocean. Fell toward the Atlantic Ocean. As it fell toward the Atlantic Ocean, as it descended, a set of parachutes deployed, slowing the casing's fall. And waiting in the ocean below were 2 specially designed ships named Freedom Star and Liberty Star, whose sole purpose was to locate those casings bobbing in the Atlantic, attach lines to them, and tow them back to Port Canaveral. There, teams of technicians would disassemble them, Inspect every surface, replace anything worn or damaged, repack them with fresh propellant, and prepare them to fly again. The same rocket casing that had just thundered off the launch pad would, months later, thunder off it again. The same metal, the same structure, reborn. Meanwhile, the orbiter and its external tank continued climbing. The 3 main engines burned on for a total of about 8.5 minutes from launch. 8.5 minutes. In that time, the shuttle accelerated from 0 to approximately 17,500 miles per hour. The speed needed to achieve orbit, to fall around the Earth fast enough that your trajectory curves down at exactly the same rate the Earth curves away beneath you, so that you are perpetually falling but never landing. At main engine cutoff, the external tank was jettisoned. Unlike the solid rocket boosters, the external tank was not recovered. It was allowed to fall back into the atmosphere, where it broke apart and the pieces descended into a remote part of the Indian Ocean. Every single mission required a brand new external tank, hand-built, carefully insulated with that distinctive orange foam, and used exactly once. But the shuttle was not yet in its final orbit. The main engines had done enough to get it most of the way there, but the final insertion into orbit was achieved by a different set of engines entirely. A pair of smaller liquid-fueled engines called the Orbital Maneuvering System, or OMS. These engines, housed in 2 pods on either side of the tail, could be fired in short burns to adjust the shuttle's speed and direction, nudging it into precisely the right orbital path. And then, for the first time since launch, there was silence. And the shuttle was simply there, floating in the sky. The engines were off, the boosters were gone, the external tank was falling away below, and the shuttle was simply there, floating in orbit, the curve of the Earth visible through the flight deck windows, the blackness of space above, the crew weightless in their seats. I find it rather moving to imagine that first moment of orbital silence after the thunderous ascent. The contrast must have been almost overwhelming, the noise and violence of launch giving way in just 8.5 minutes to this extraordinary calm. From there, the mission could begin. The shuttle typically orbited at an altitude of between 190 and 330 miles above the Earth, traveling at that remarkable speed of 17,500 miles per hour, which means it completed 1 full orbit of the Earth roughly every 90 minutes. Sunrise and sunset every 45 minutes. 16 sunrises in a single day. Imagine watching the sun set and then watching it rise again 16 times before you go to sleep. Once in orbit, the payload bay doors were opened and the shuttle transformed. Those large doors, stretching almost the full length of the payload bay, swung open and stayed open for the duration of the mission. This was partly to allow access to whatever cargo the shuttle was carrying, satellites to be deployed, or equipment to be used. But it was also thermal engineering. The inside surfaces of those doors were lined with radiators that allowed the shuttle to shed the heat generated by its systems into the cold of space. Without those doors open, the vehicle would overheat, keeping them closed was not an option for more than a short time in orbit. And tucked inside that payload bay on many missions was the Canadarm. Its full name was the Remote Manipulator System, and it was provided by the Canadian Space Agency, a contribution from Canada to the Shuttle program that became one of its most celebrated and useful features. 50 feet long, with 6 joints that allowed it to move with something approaching the dexterity of a human arm. The Canadarm could reach out from the payload bay and grasp satellites, deploy them, retrieve them, or hold them steady while astronauts worked on them during spacewalks. It was operated from inside the shuttle by an astronaut standing at a window at the rear of the flight deck, looking back into the payload bay, guiding the arm's movements with hand controllers. On some missions, the arm performed extraordinary feats of precision, gently capturing a slowly tumbling satellite and bringing it to rest so that the crew could begin repairs. On other missions, it was used to lift spacewalking astronauts to locations on the outside of the vehicle that they could not otherwise reach. A mechanical cherry picker in the void of space. The Canadarm flew on the shuttle for the first time in 1981 and went on to assist with some of the most famous moments in the program's history. It is the kind of detail that, once you know it, makes the whole enterprise feel even more like a collaboration, a coming together of human ingenuity from many corners of the world. And so the shuttle would work, sometimes for a week, sometimes for 2 weeks, occasionally longer, circling the Earth in that companionable silence, the crew going about their tasks, conducting experiments, deploying hardware, looking out the windows at the impossible blue curve of the world below. It is a rather lovely thing to fall asleep to, I think. The image of a small, warm, busy spacecraft crossing the face of the Earth over and over again in the dark and the silence, the crew floating gently between their tasks, the planet turning slowly beneath them. 16 sunrises a day. Let your breathing slow. Let the quiet settle around you. There is no rush. The orbit will carry us gently on. Coming home. We have launched together, felt the thunder of those solid rocket boosters, climbed through 8.5 minutes of fire into the silence of orbit. We have watched the sun rise 16 times in a single day and imagined the crew floating weightlessly about their work. Now, very gently, let us think about coming home, because returning from orbit is, in many ways, even more remarkable than getting there. And it is a process full of beautiful details that I think are perfectly suited to the quiet of a late evening. To understand reentry, we first need to understand what orbit actually is, because it is something a little more interesting than simply being very high up. When the shuttle was in orbit, it was not hovering. It was falling, constantly, perpetually falling toward the Earth. But it was also moving sideways so fast, 17,500 miles per hour, that the curve of its fall matched the curve of the Earth below it. So it fell and never got any closer to the ground. It was in a continuous state of balanced falling, which is what weightlessness actually is. Not the absence of gravity, but the experience of falling freely with nothing to push back against you. To come home, the shuttle needed to slow down, not much in the grand scheme of things. A reduction in speed of only about 200 miles per hour was enough to tip the balance, to make the shuttle's trajectory curve downward slightly faster than the Earth curved away beneath it. From that point, gravity would do the rest. This slowing was achieved by what was called the deorbit burn. The crew would orient the shuttle so that its tail was pointing in the direction of travel, and then fire the orbital maneuvering system engines for a carefully calculated period of time, typically around 2 to 3 minutes. 2 to 3 minutes of engine burn to end a mission that might have lasted 2 weeks. The mathematics of orbital mechanics are rather elegant in that way. Small changes precisely applied with enormous consequences. After the deorbit burn, the shuttle was committed to returning to Earth. There was no going back to orbit from this point. The crew rotated the vehicle again, this time to fly nose first, belly toward Earth, tilted at a steep angle of about 40 degrees from horizontal. This was the reentry attitude, and it was chosen very carefully. Here is why that angle matters. As the shuttle descended into the upper atmosphere, it was moving so fast that the air in front of it could not get out of the way quickly enough. Instead, that air was compressed, and compressed air heats up. At orbital velocity, the temperatures generated by this compression reached somewhere around 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit on the nose and wing leading edges. 3,000 degrees. That is roughly half the temperature of the surface of the sun. The 40-degree nose-high attitude was chosen to use the shuttle's broad, flat belly as a kind of giant air brake. By pointing the nose up and the belly forward, the vehicle created a cushion of compressed, superheated air beneath it. A shock wave that actually kept most of that extreme heat away from the structure. The belly bore the brunt of the heating, and the rest of the vehicle was partially shielded. But the belly still needed to survive those temperatures, and aluminum, the primary material of the shuttle structure, melts at just over 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. So something extraordinary had to be placed between the aluminum skin and the fire of re-entry. That something was the thermal protection system, and it is one of the most fascinating pieces of engineering in the entire shuttle program. The most numerous component of the thermal protection system was the thermal tile. The shuttle's underside was covered in approximately 20,000 of them, each one individually shaped to fit its precise location on the vehicle. Each one individually numbered and cataloged. No two tiles were exactly alike. These tiles were made of a material called Li-900 silica ceramic, and it has properties that sound almost impossible until you understand the science behind them. Li-900 is made of silica glass fibers, extremely fine strands of essentially the same material as ordinary glass. But here is the thing that makes it remarkable. The material is 94% air by volume. 94%. The glass fibers form a delicate, lace-like structure, and the spaces between those fibers are filled with nothing. The tile is almost entirely empty space, held together in a rigid, foam-like matrix of glass threads. This structure gave the tiles an astonishing property. They were almost perfectly insulating. Heat could not travel through all that empty space quickly enough to do damage. A tile could be heated to 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit on one surface and be cool enough to hold in your bare hand on the other surface at the same moment. There is a famous NASA demonstration of this, where a technician picks up a freshly heated tile with unprotected fingers just seconds after it has been glowing white hot. The outside surface has already cooled to the point where it can be safely touched, while the interior is still radiating heat gently into the air. And those tiles were also extraordinarily light, with a density of only 9 pounds per cubic foot. They were lighter than balsa wood. You could hold one in your palm and feel almost nothing. But there was a problem with the tiles, and it is a problem that illustrates the beautiful complexity of engineering. The tiles were made of a rigid, brittle ceramic. The shuttle's aluminum skin beneath them was flexible. It expanded and contracted with temperature changes, and it flexed slightly under aerodynamic loads during launch and re-entry. If the tiles had been glued directly to the skin, that flexing would have cracked them. So, between each tile and the aluminum skin, engineers placed a thin layer of felt made from Nomex, a heat-resistant synthetic fabric. This felt layer, called a strain isolation pad, absorbed the movement of the aluminum skin and decoupled it from the rigid tile above. The tile could sit perfectly still while the skin moved beneath it, the felt acting as a kind of gentle mediator between two materials that needed to coexist but could not directly touch. 20,000 individual tiles, 20,000 individual felt pads, 20,000 individual inspections after every single flight, checking for chips, cracks, missing pieces, any sign of damage that might compromise the protection on the next mission. The leading edges of the wings and the nose cap faced even higher temperatures than the belly tiles, and for these areas, a different material was needed altogether. These regions were covered in reinforced carbon-carbon, a composite material made by taking carbon fibers, forming them into shape, and then infiltrating that structure with additional carbon through a high-temperature chemical process. The result was a material that actually became stronger at high temperatures rather than weaker, and could withstand temperatures above 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit without degrading. The nose cap of the shuttle, that distinctive rounded point at the very front, was a single piece of reinforced carbon-carbon. Every time the shuttle re-entered the atmosphere, that nose cap glowed. It absorbed the heat of re-entry and radiated it away as light, a soft orange glow visible from the ground on night re-entries. The nose of the spacecraft lit up like an ember. I find that image rather beautiful. This extraordinary machine, returning from space, its nose glowing softly in the dark sky, all that heat converted quietly into light. As the shuttle descended through the atmosphere, slowing as it went, it transitioned from spacecraft to something more like a very heavy, very fast glider. The orbital maneuvering system engines that had served it in space could not work in the atmosphere, and the shuttle had no jet engines for powered flight. From the moment it hit the upper atmosphere, the crew had one chance to reach the runway. There was no going around for another attempt, no engine to add power if the approach was too low. If you missed the runway, you missed it. The commander and pilot flew a series of wide, curving turns called energy management turns, using the shuttle's wings to bleed off speed and altitude in a controlled way, like a very precisely executed spiral descent. The goal was to arrive at the runway threshold at exactly the right speed and exactly the right altitude, having used up exactly the right amount of energy on the way down. At around 50,000 feet, the shuttle was still traveling at several times the speed of sound. By the time it reached 10,000 feet, it had slowed to subsonic speeds, and then, in the final minutes of flight, it swept in over the runway in a steeply angled approach, far steeper than a commercial airliner, around 20 degrees compared to the 3 degrees of a normal aircraft approach, and touched down at approximately 220 miles per hour. Landing at 220 miles per hour on a runway with no engine power and no ability to go around, after 2 weeks in space, after the most dramatic re-entry in the history of aviation, and doing it safely, mission after mission. Now, landing could happen at several different places. The primary landing site was the Shuttle landing facility at Kennedy Space Center in Florida, a specially built runway long enough to accommodate the shuttle's fast approach. But weather in Florida could be unpredictable, and if conditions were not suitable, the backup was Edwards Air Force Base in California, out in the Mojave Desert, where the vast dry lake bed of Rogers Dry Lake provided an enormous natural runway with very forgiving margins for error. Edwards was actually where the very first shuttle landing took place, the landing of Columbia at the end of STS-1 in April 1981. The wide, flat desert felt like the right place for something unprecedented, something whose behavior in those final moments was not yet fully known. There was also a site called White Sands Space Harbor in New Mexico, a runway built on a dry lake bed of white gypsum sand. White Sands was used only once, for the landing of Columbia at the end of STS-3, after a storm made the lake bed at Edwards temporarily unusable. The white surface of the gypsum created problems of its own, getting into the vehicle's systems in ways that took considerable time to address. It was not used again. And beyond the United States, NASA maintained a network of what were called transoceanic abort landing sites, runways in Spain and France that could receive the shuttle if an engine failure occurred at the particular point in the ascent when the vehicle was too far from Florida to turn back but had not yet reached orbital velocity. These sites in Zaragoza, Moron, and Istres were maintained in a state of readiness for every single launch, their crews on standby, their runways clear, just in case. They were never actually used for an emergency landing, but the fact that they existed at all speaks to the thoroughness with which every contingency was considered. Once the shuttle touched down, there was one more small detail I find rather lovely. The main engines, of course, were not running. The orbital maneuvering engines were not running. the shuttle rolled to a stop entirely on its own momentum, helped by its wheel brakes and, on later missions, a drag chute that deployed from the tail to slow the vehicle more quickly. And then it sat there on the runway, still hot from re-entry, the crew inside going through post-landing checks, ground crews approaching cautiously to check for any toxic gases from the reaction control system thrusters before it was safe to open the hatch. The entire journey from deorbit burn to wheel stop took about an hour to come home from space. And when the hatch finally opened and the crew stepped out, some of them unsteady on legs that had not needed to bear weight for a week or two, blinking in the sunlight or the floodlights depending on the time of landing, they were standing on the same Earth they had left. But they had been somewhere extraordinary in between. Let that thought settle softly over you as you rest. The same Earth, but somewhere extraordinary in between. Your breathing is slow, the night is quiet. Let the image of that glowing nose in the dark sky drift gently through your mind, the shuttle coming home, the runway lights stretching ahead in the desert dark, the wheels touching down. Sleep is not far now, let it come. And so we come gently to the end of our journey together tonight. We have traveled quite a long way, you and I, from the dreaming rooms of 1960s NASA through the compromises and the clever engineering, up through 8.5 minutes of fire into the silence of orbit, and then home again through a glowing sky. The space shuttle was not a perfect machine. It was a compromise, shaped by budgets and politics and the competing needs of many different people. But within all of those constraints, the men and women who designed and built and flew it created something that carried 355 individual human beings to space across 135 missions over 30 years. It deployed telescopes that changed our understanding of the universe. It built a space station that is still up there right now, tonight, passing overhead as you lie in your bed, moving silently across the sky at 17,500 miles per hour. And now it is time to rest. You have been such wonderful company on this journey, and I hope that somewhere in all of these quiet facts and gentle stories, your mind has found something soft to hold on to as sleep comes to find you. In just a moment, the music will begin, and it will stay with you for a long time after my voice has gone. Let your thoughts drift wherever they would like to go. Maybe to the desert runway in the early morning, the shuttle sitting still after its long journey home. Maybe to the view from the flight deck windows, the curve of the earth below, the stars above, everything impossibly quiet. Or maybe your mind will wander somewhere else entirely, somewhere only you know, and that is perfectly wonderful too. There is nothing left for you to do tonight, no decisions to make, no problems to solve, no places to be, just the music and your breath and the dark and sleep arriving slowly like a tide coming in. Thank you for spending this time with Orbit into Sleep. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, a like and a subscription means other restless minds like yours might find their way here too, and that feels like a rather nice thing. Good night. Sleep beautifully.